The cold came early in December 1914, a brutal, invasive presence that ignored national borders and military allegiances. It swept across the Western Front from the North Sea to the Swiss border, a 1,000-mile scar on the face of Europe where millions of men now lived in holes in the ground. This was not the crisp, festive cold of Christmas card scenes, the kind that reddened cheeks and made breath plume cheerfully. This was a malevolent, penetrating cold that seeped through wool greatcoats, through leather boots, through flesh and bone to settle in the very marrow. It froze the infamous Flanders mud into a bizarre, sculpted landscape. Shell craters with sides like concrete, frozen waves of earth thrown up by explosions, the stiffened corpses of men and horses preserved in mid-action like grotesque statues in a garden of death. It froze the water in canteens, the grease in rifles, the ink in pens. It froze time itself, making the endless, grinding stalemate feel eternal, as if summer had never existed and never would again. In the British trenches near the Belgian village of Ploeg steered Plug Street to the Tommies, the cold was a third front to be fought, as dangerous as German machine guns or artillery. Private Samuel Bennett, a violin maker from Manchester whose delicate hands were now cracked and bleeding from digging and frost, had developed a ritual. Every morning, he would take off his boots and massage his feet for exactly 10 minutes, counting silently. Trench foot was a creeping horror. The flesh would turn white, then purple, then black as gangrene set in, and the only cure was amputation. 2 men from his platoon had already been sent back with it, their feet rotting off them. Sam was determined not to be the third. As he rubbed his pale, waxy toes, he thought of his workshop at home, the smell of spruce and maple shavings, the feel of well-oiled tools, the delicate process of carving a violin's scroll. That world felt as distant and impossible as the moon. Next to him, hunched in a niche carved into the trench wall, was Private Albert Smudger Smith, a newspaper printer from Leeds whose face was perpetually smudged with dirt or ink or both. Smudger was trying to write a letter to his wife, his hands shaking so violently the pencil strokes were jagged, childish. "My dearest Annie," he wrote. "Another cold one. The rations are poor but we manage. I think of you and the girls every moment. Is little Molly's cough better? Tell her Dad is thinking of her. I have a small gift for you, found it in a ruined house. A pretty hair comb. I will bring it home. We hear it might be over by Christmas. God willing. Your loving Albert." He folded the letter around a hair comb, a simple tortoise-shell thing, one tooth broken, and put it in his breast pocket. He didn't believe the over by Christmas nonsense, not anymore. They'd been told that in August. Now it was December, and they were deeper in hell than ever. As dusk gathered, a slow, grey leaching of the scant daylight, a new sound cut through the usual background orchestra of distant shelling and sniper fire. It was a human sound, but not one of war. It was singing. A single, strong baritone voice from the German trenches, maybe 80 yards away across the frozen corpse field of no man's land. The tune was unmistakable, Still Nacht, Heilige Nacht. Silent Night. Sam stopped massaging his feet. Smudger looked up from pretending to sleep. All along their section of trench, men straightened, listened. The German voice was joined by others. Soon a full chorus was singing the carol, the sound carrying with unnatural clarity in the cold, still air. It was beautiful. It was also profoundly disorienting. For months, the only sounds from those trenches had been gunfire, shouted orders, the screams of the wounded. This was something else entirely. Then, from their own trench, a voice started up. Young, Welsh, singing the English words. Silent Night, Holy Night. Others joined hesitantly at first, then with more strength. Soon, up and down the British line, men were singing. The two carols wove together across the frozen waste, German and English harmonies mingling in a way that should have been impossible. Sam felt a physical ache in his chest. He thought of the carol service at Manchester Cathedral last Christmas, the soaring voices, the candlelight, the sense of peace. That memory was a physical pain now. Then came the visual miracle. Along the German parapet, small points of light appeared. Dozens of them. They were candles, actual Christmas candles fixed to the tops of rifles, stuck in the dirt, placed on the fire step. The soft, golden light was a shocking contrast to the usual harsh white glare of star shells or the flash of explosions. In that gentle illumination, they could see German soldiers moving about, could see the dark shapes of small Christmas trees. A German voice called out, the accent thick but the words clear. Englishman. You no shoot. We no shoot. Christmas. Lieutenant James Chalmers, their commander, a banker in peacetime, now a perpetually tired-looking man of 25, moved quickly down the trench. Stay at your posts. It's a ruse. They'll cut us down. But the men were already beyond such cautions. A sergeant from Glasgow, a veteran of Mons named McGregor, stood up. Sir, with respect, they're singing Silent Night. I dinna think it's a trick. Chalmers looked at the faces of his men. He saw not battle lust, but a desperate, hungry hope. He saw Sam Bennett, the violin maker, with tears freezing on his cheeks. He saw Smudger Smith clutching his letter to his chest. He sighed, a sound of utter weariness. Very well, he said, his voice tight. But in pairs. And unarmed. Jenkins, you and Carter go first. No one moved. Then, from the German side, a single soldier climbed out of his trench. He held a branch of pine above his head like a flag of truce. He walked into no man's land, placed the branch in the frozen mud, and returned to his trench. That broke the last resistance. Men began climbing out from both sides. Not in ordered pairs, but in a slow, cautious flood. They met in the middle, where the barbed wire was less thick, or where shell craters provided meeting places. The first encounters were awkward, shy. Nods were exchanged. Then a German held out a cigarette. A Tommy offered a match. The ice, both literal and metaphorical, was broken. Sam found himself facing a German soldier about his own age, with intelligent blue eyes and a wispy blonde mustache. The German smiled nervously and held out a small, wax paper wrapped parcel. Stolen, he said. Christmas cake. Sam, having nothing else, broke his last piece of hardtack in two and offered half. The trade was made. The German pointed to himself. Ernst. He was from Hamburg, he explained in broken English. A shipbuilder's apprentice. Sam explained about violins. They sat on the lip of a crater, eating the dry stolen and harder hardtack, and for 20 minutes, they were not enemies. They were Samuel and Ernst, two craftsmen far from home, talking about wood grain and tool sharpness while around them the war ceased to exist. All along the line, similar scenes unfolded. Gifts were exchanged, cigarettes for sausage, chocolate for plum pudding, buttons for badges. Someone produced a deflated leather football. A chaotic, laughing match erupted in the cratered field, British and German soldiers slipping and sliding on the frozen mud, falling together in heaps, helping each other up. Goals were marked with helmets. There was no referee, no score kept. The joy was in the playing, in the simple, physical act of running and kicking and lapping under an open sky, not crouched in a hole. Then came the sober work. A joint party formed, British and German volunteers, to collect the frozen dead from no man's land. The bodies were stiff, heavy, difficult to maneuver. They were laid side by side in a long, communal grave dug with picks that rang against the frozen earth. The nationalities were mixed, a British private next to a German fusilier next to a French chasseur. A German soldier who had been a theology student before the war said prayers in German and Latin. A British sergeant major, his voice husky with an emotion no one could name, read from the Psalms. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. They stood together, enemies united in grief for the sons, brothers, and fathers they were burying, men who, but for the color of their uniform, were indistinguishable from themselves. As darkness fell completely, the men began to drift back to their respective trenches. Sam shook Ernst's hand. Good luck, he said. Do ouch, Ernst replied. You too. He pressed something into Sam's hand, a small, beautifully carved wooden soldier, a German infantryman in accurate detail. For your workshop. To remember. Sam was too choked to speak. He nodded, clasped Ernst's hand tighter, then turned away. In his pocket, he carried the wooden soldier, the stub of German sausage, and a profound dislocation that would never fully leave him. That night, the Western Front fell into a silence deeper than any since the war began. Not the nervous quiet between bombardments, but a true, profound peace. The stars, invisible for months through smoke and cloud, blazed with icy brilliance in a black velvet sky. Men stood on the fire steps, looking up at them, smoking, thinking of home. In both trenches, voices continued to sing carols, sometimes alternating, sometimes joining together. At one point, a German band actually played God Save the King. The British responded with Die Wacht am Rhein. It was surreal, beautiful, and utterly heartbreaking. The truce lasted through Christmas Day in most sectors. In some places, it continued until New Year's. Men exchanged addresses, promised to meet after the war. Photographs were taken smiling groups of British and German soldiers with their arms around each other's shoulders. For a few precious days, the war was not just paused, it was forgotten. The enemy had a face, a name, a family, a favorite food. He was human. The miracle ended with a thunderclap of artillery on December 27. Orders from high command on both sides, horrified by the fraternization, demanded a return to hostilities. The Christmas peace was shelled into memory. But for every man who was there, the memory became a sacred, secret thing, a glimpse of a world that could be held close in the heart as the world descended back into industrialized slaughter. Sam Bennett would carry the wooden German soldier through the Somme, where he would see men melted by flamethrowers. He would carry it through Passchendaele, where he would drown a wounded comrade himself to spare him a slower death in the liquid mud. He would carry it until the armistice in 1918, and then home to Manchester, where he would place it on the shelf in his workshop, next to the half-finished violin he'd left in August 1914. He would look at it every day for the next 50 years, but he would never speak of Ernst, or the football match, or the shared grave. Some truths were too fragile for words. The war learned from Christmas 1914. It hardened. The Christmas of 1915 was a different beast entirely. Orders were explicit, no fraternization. Any attempt would be met with machine gun fire. Sentries were doubled. Officers patrolled constantly. The propaganda had done its work, the enemy was now a subhuman Hun, a monster to be destroyed, not a potential friend. The sentimental fraternity of 1914 was viewed as a dangerous aberration, a failure of military discipline. On the French front at Verdun, Christmas Day 1915 dawned not with carols, but with a German artillery barrage of such intensity it seemed the earth itself was screaming. In Fort Douaumont, a massive, dank, subterranean fortress that smelled of fungus, unwashed men, and fear, Corporal Etienne Durand tried to block out the world by writing a letter to his daughter. The only light came from a ration tin filled with tallow and a ragwick, the flame guttering in the damp air. His hands shook, but from a constant, nerve-shredding exhaustion more than cold. Ma chère petite Marie. Today is Noël. I imagine you by the tree, wondering if Père Noël will find Papa in his strange house underground. He will. He has left a gift for you with Mom and a little bird I carved from a piece of oak I found here. It is not much, but I thought of your love for the sparrows in our garden. Do not think of me in a sad place. We have made a kind of home here, and the men sing sometimes, though the songs are not the ones you know. The world outside is very loud, but in my heart, it is quiet, and I am listening to you tell me about your day. Be good for Mom and Ton Papa qui t'aime. He folded the letter around a tiny, carefully whittled bird and put it in a tin. He would give it to the next courier heading to the rear, if a courier ever made it through the constant shelling. The home he wrote of was a labyrinth of dripping tunnels where men went mad from the constant noise. Where the only water was what seeped through the concrete, where the dead were stacked inside chambers because it was too dangerous to take them out. The singing was drunken, desperate roars to drown out the shelling. The miracle of 1914 felt like a fairy tale from another, naive lifetime. Here, Christmas was just another day in the endless, grinding mill of Verdun, where the only gifts were bullets and the only carols were the screams of the wounded. High above the frozen hell of the trenches, the war had taken to the air, and there, a last vestige of chivalry and Christmas spirit flickered. On Christmas Day 1916, a British Re-8 reconnaissance plane, its wings painted with bold roundels, sputtered through a clear, icy sky over the Somme battlefield. In the observer's seat, Lieutenant Simon Cartwright scanned the white landscape below through binoculars. The trenches were dark lines on a dirty tablecloth of snow. He was making notes on a map, marking artillery positions. His pilot, a young Canadian named Mackenzie with a seemingly perpetual grin, nudged him and pointed. A German Albatross D.2, its wings marked with stark black crosses, was approaching from the east. But it wasn't diving to attack. It was flying parallel to them, maintaining a respectful distance. Cartwright raised his binoculars. He could see the German pilot clearly. The man was waving. Not a hostile gesture, but a simple, open-handed salute. Then the German plane banked slightly, and Cartwright saw something small and dark tumble from its cockpit. It wasn't a bomb. It fell, twirling, a tiny parachute what looked like a handkerchief deploying to slow its descent. The Albatross waggled its wings once more and turned away, heading back to its own lines. Mackenzie, after a moment's hesitation, circled and descended toward where the object had fallen, a relatively soft snowdrift behind the British front lines. They landed in a bumpy, improvised field, the skids cutting through the snow. Soldiers, curious, ran over from a nearby dugout. Cartwright climbed out, his flying suit stiff with cold, and trudged to the spot. There, half buried in the snow, was a bottle. He pulled it out. It was German Sekt sparkling wine. Tied to it with a red and black ribbon was a note. Cartwright uncorked it with numb fingers. The note, in careful English, read, "To our valiant enemies in the sky. A toast to your courage and skill. May we meet again in better times. Merry Christmas. Just 11." It was signed with a small, stylized drawing of a winged helmet. The soldiers gathered round, laughing in disbelief. That evening, in a drafty barn serving as an RFC mess, the bottle was shared among the pilots. The toast was drunk in silence. The wine was excellent, dry and crisp. The gesture was from another age. Cartwright kept the note. He would survive the war, though Mackenzie would not shot down over Cambrai in 1917. The note would sit framed on Cartwright's desk for the next 40 years, a testament to the strangest, most poignant Christmas gift he ever received, from a man whose name he never knew but whose face he would never forget. Beneath the earth, the war was fought by men turned moles, and there, the Christmas spirit took on a ghostly, horrific quality. In the Ypres salient, Christmas Eve 1916 found Sapper Reginald Tiny Collins, a giant of a man from Cornwall, 30 feet below the surface in a British mining gallery. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, damp clay, and the sweet, cloying tang of aminal high explosive. The only sounds were the soft scrape of shovels, the occasional drip of water, and the terrifying, amplified creaks of the timber props overhead, bearing the weight of the world and the war above. They were laying the final charge for a mine under a German strongpoint called White Sheet. It was cold work, but away from the shelling. In a small alcove, a single candle burned on an upturned ammunition box, casting monstrous, dancing shadows. Next to it, Tiny had propped up a postcard from his wife. It showed a snowy Cornish cove, the sea grey and cold. On the back, she had written, "The children made a paper chain for you. We hung it on the mantel. Tom says to tell you the donkey is well. We miss you every second. Your loving Rose." Tiny's partner in the gallery was a young Welsh miner named Di, who was humming "Deck the Hall" softly, almost under his breath, as he tamped explosive into place. "Think they're singing up there, Tiny?" Di whispered, nodding upward toward the German lines 30 feet above them. "Wouldn't know," Tiny grunted, connecting two primer cords with meticulous, deliberate care. "Don't hear nothing down here but us and the rats." But then they heard it. Faint, muffled by 30 feet of solid blue clay, but unmistakable. A deep, resonant chorus of men's voices. O Tannenbaum, we Truce in den Blätter. O Christmas tree. It was coming from the German gallery, parallel and frighteningly close to their own. The digging had stopped. The enemy miners, in the dark, in the earth, were singing. Tiny and Die froze, their shovels still. The sound was ghostly, beautiful, and profoundly isolating. They were down here in the absolute dark, preparing to blow these singers into atoms. Die stopped humming. The cheer from the postcard, the memory of paper chains, seemed to shrivel and die in the damp, explosive-laden air. Tiny finished the connection, his big hands steady. Right, he said, his voice hollow in the confined space. That's it? Let's get out. They backed out of the gallery, winding the detonation wire behind them. The German carol faded into the ringing silence of the tunnels. On Christmas morning, at 5:17 a.m., Tiny would turn the handle of the exploder. The earth would leap, and the German strongpoint, and the miners who sang O Tannenbaum in the dark, would cease to exist. Tiny would receive a military medal for his actions. He would never speak of the singing. He would drink himself to death by 1932, found in a ditch in Penzance, the postcard from Rose still in his pocket. The sea knew no Christmas, only the cold, dark calculus of the kill. In the North Atlantic, on December 24, 1917, the U-boat U-84 prowled beneath a stormy, moonless sky. Inside the steel tube, the atmosphere was thick with tension and the smell of diesel, sweat, and boiled cabbage. They had been at sea for 6 weeks with no kills. Food was low. Morale was lower. The captain, Karl Emil Schroeder, was a grim, by-the-book Prussian from a long line of naval officers. There would be no celebrations, no sentimentalities. The soundman's voice crackled with sudden tension. Propeller sounds, bearing 280. Slow. Single screw. Merchant, possibly tanker. Schroeder came to the periscope, his movements economical, precise. The night was a black void, but the ship was a darker silhouette against the slightly less dark sky. No lights. A blockade runner. Up periscope. Stand by tubes 1 and 2. Set depth 4 meters, speed 30 knots. In the forward torpedo room, Seaman Franz Huber checked the settings on the G7E electric torpedo. His hands performed the tasks by rote, but his mind was 1,000 miles away, in a small apartment in Kiel. In the pocket over his heart was a letter from his fiancée, Lottie, delivered just before they sailed. Mein lieber Franz, the tree is up in the square, but it feels hollow without you. I knitted you socks, the wool is the blue of your eyes. I pray they keep you warm. Come back to me. Your loving Lottie. He had not yet written back. What could he say? My dear Lottie, today I helped prepare a torpedo that will likely kill 30 men who also have sweethearts knitting them socks. My feet are cold. Fire 1. The submarine jolted slightly. The torpedo was away, a silent, electric death in the dark water. The count began. 40 seconds. A minute. Nothing. Miss Schroeder's jaw tightened. Fire 2. Another jolt. Another agonizing wait. Then, a satisfying, muffled crump that vibrated through the entire hull, a physical sensation in the bones. A cheer went up in the control room. Schroeder kept the periscope up. She's going down. Tanker. Good hit amidships. He watched as the ship, its back broken, settled quickly by the stern. The sea was too rough to see lifeboats. Take us down to 60 meters, course 040. Silent running. As they dove, the cook, an older reservist named Gunther who had owned a bakery in Bremen before the war, appeared with a small pot. Herr Kaleu, he said softly, his voice respectful but firm. It is Christmas Eve. I have saved some raisins and a bit of schnapps from my private store. A small toast for the men? For morale. Schroeder looked at the expectant, gaunt faces in the control room. He saw Franz Huber's eyes, empty of the triumph the others felt, fixed on the deck plating. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. One toast. Then back to stations. The schnapps, harsh and cheap, was poured into tin cups. Gunter raised his Auf ein besseres Jahr. To a better year. They drank. The alcohol burned, a fleeting, false warmth in the cold, metallic air. Franz felt the heat hit his stomach. He thought of Lottie's tree in the square, the blue socks, the men in the freezing water above them. The toast tasted of salt and metal and a shame so deep he could give it no name. There was no Christmas under the sea. Only the dark, the pressure, and the kill. They sank deeper, leaving the dying tanker and its crew to the mercy of the winter Atlantic. The final Christmas of the war, 1918, was a celebration in a phantom world. The armistice was signed, but not yet the peace. The guns were silent, but their echo rang in a million heads. For the men still in France and Belgium, waiting for ships home, the war was not over. It lived in the twitch of a hand at a slammed door, in the nightmares that had them screaming in barracks, in the inability to feel joy at the peace they'd survived to see. In a captured German barracks near Trier, now occupied by American troops of the 89th Division, Corporal Michael O'Malley from Cincinnati stared at a sorry excuse for a Christmas tree. It was a bare fir branch stuck in a bucket of dirt, decorated with empty .30-06 brass casings, strips of tin from ration cans hammered into crude stars, and a single, ragged strip of white cloth that might have been a bandage. The men of his squad sat around it, smoking, playing endless, silent games of cards, writing the same letters home over and over. They had won. They were the victors, the doughboys who had turned the tide. They were alive. So why did they feel like ghosts? Mike had seen the photographs from the 1914 truce in the Stars and Stripes. The enemies shaking hands. The football match. It seemed like archaeology, a relic from a more innocent, distant past. His war had been the Meuse-Argonne dance. Fog-shrouded forests where death came silently from the trees, relentless machine gun nests that had to be taken with bayonet and grenade, mud that swallowed men whole, and the sudden, wet thump of a buddy being hit beside you. The enemy had been an abstract terror, a muzzle flash, a shouted order in guttural German, a stick grenade arcing through the air. There had been no Christmas truce in the Argonne. There had only been the cold, the fear, the smell of pine needles and blood, and the order to advance into the murderous fire. Yet, in the winter of 1918, a different kind of meeting was happening. In the shattered villages along the Moselle, American soldiers were handing out chocolate and canned milk to skeletal German children who stared at them with huge, wary eyes. They were giving their rations to old women who reminded them of their own grandmothers. They were playing catch with boys using baseballs from home. The war was over, and the simple, human instinct to help, brutalized and suppressed for years by the need to kill, was reasserting itself, awkwardly, painfully. It was a truce not between armies, but between victors and the broken vanquished, brokered by the universal currency of a child's smile at the gift of a piece of chocolate. Mike found himself guarding a work detail of German prisoners clearing the main street of a village called Kassel. The prisoners, mostly older men and boys, the regular army having dissolved, worked slowly, moving rubble with bare, bleeding hands. One prisoner, a man in his 50s with the strong, stooped shoulders of a farmer or a mason, worked with particular care. As Mike watched, the man bent and picked something from the debris. He brushed the plaster dust from it tenderly. It was a small, ceramic Christmas angel, about 4 inches tall, meant for the top of a tree. One wing was missing, and its face was cracked, but it still held a tiny trumpet. The German prisoner stared at the angel, his face crumbling. Then, silently, his shoulders began to shake. He made no sound, but tears cut clean tracks through the grime on his weathered cheeks. He clutched the broken angel to his chest and wept, his entire body trembling with a grief that seemed to come from the earth itself. Mike looked away, allowing the man his private cathedral of sorrow. The enemy, up close, was just a man mourning a broken angel, a symbol of everything that had been shattered. Mike thought of the angel his mother placed on their tree every year in Ohio, a delicate thing of blown glass. He felt a connection to this weeping stranger that was deeper, more real, than any hatred drilled into him in training. Later, during a break, Mike approached the man. He held out his canteen. The German looked at him, suspicion in his red-rimmed eyes, then nodded and took it, drinking deeply. "Danke," he whispered, his voice raspy. Mike pointed to his own chest. "Michael." He pointed to the German. The man understood. "Johann," he said. Mike pointed to the angel, which Johann still cradled. "For your family." Johann shook his head slowly. He made a sweeping gesture that took in the entire ruined village, the smashed houses, the cratered street. Then he pointed to the sky, and then to his own heart. Mike understood. The angel was for the village. For all that was lost. For the Christmases that would never be the same. Johann carefully placed the angel on a relatively flat piece of a broken windowsill, an altar in the ruins. He gave Mike a small, sad, infinitely weary smile, then went back to moving stones. Mike didn't report the incident. He just watched Johann work, the old man handling each piece of rubble as if it were a relic, looking for more survivors, more fragments of the world that was. The enemy was not a monster. He was Johann, who cried over broken angels. On a hillside overlooking the old front line near Verdun, now just a stark, treeless ridge against the winter sky, an old French farmer and his grandson were gathering the last of the season's firewood. The boy, Luke, was 9, thin but sharp-eyed. He kicked at a frozen tussock of grass, his boot hitting something metallic. He dug with his small hands, the dirt iron hard. He pulled out a rusted, French Adrian helmet, the crest still faintly visible, a bullet hole clean through the front. He held it up to his grandfather. "Regard as, grandpère." The old man, Philippe, took the helmet, turning it over in his calloused, farmer's hands. He didn't see a piece of war debris. He saw the young poilu from Normandy who had been billeted in his barn in the winter of 1915. The soldier's name had been Marcel. He had given Philippe's own son, Jacques-Luc's father, killed at the Chemin des Dames in 1917, his first taste of Calvados. He had taught Jacques a card game. Marcel had given young Luc, then just a baby, a little tin whistle. Philippe remembered the sound of Marcel's laugh, a quick, nervous sound that had nonetheless filled the cold barn with a fleeting warmth. He remembered Marcel showing him a photograph of his own family's farm in Normandy, the apple trees in bloom. "C'est un garçon," Philippe said softly to his grandson, his voice thick. He was a boy. Philippe placed the helmet gently on a low stone wall that bordered what had once been his wheat field. Luc, understanding, found a sprig of winter ivy, still green, and placed it carefully beside the helmet. They stood there for a long moment, the old man and the boy, looking at the rusted helmet and the green ivy against the grey stone. Then Philippe put his hand on Luc's thin shoulder, and they turned for home, their arms full of the meager firewood. This was the final, true Christmas of the Great War. Not a truce between armies, but a slow, painful, necessary truce with memory itself. The land was beginning its centuries-long work of healing, of covering the scars with grass and wild poppies. The men who had survived were beginning the impossible journey home, carrying the war within them like a second skeleton, a framework of horror around which they would have to rebuild their lives. And everywhere, from Flanders to the Vosges, the iron harvest continued, the plows and shovels turning up rusted rifles, gleaming shell casings, bone fragments, buttons, and the occasional, heartbreakingly personal relic. A tin of plum pudding from 1914, a harmonica with a bullet hole through it, a water-stained letter that began, "My dearest, it is Christmas Eve and I am thinking of you as I never have before." The camera pulls back, high above that French hillside, higher and higher. We see old Philippe and young Luc walking home, two small figures against the vast, wounded landscape. We see the endless fields, some already being plowed again, the fresh, dark earth covering the old scars. We see the vast, silent cemeteries, British, French, German, American rows of white crosses and stones stretching to the horizon, heartbreaking in their geometric perfection. We see the roads where convoys now carry not shells and troops, but lumber, bricks, seeds, hope. The snow begins to fall again, gentle and relentless, covering the old trenches, the shell holes, the rusted tangles of wire, with a clean, forgiving, white blanket. It falls on British graves and German graves alike. It falls on the helmet on the wall. It falls on the living and the dead. It falls, and it falls, and it falls. Our final image is not of battle, but of a quiet museum gallery. In a glass display case, under soft, diffuse light, artifacts are arranged not by nationality, but by theme, connection. A German button next to a British cap badge. A French passe-montagne next to a German stall helm. A tin of British plum pudding, still sealed, next to a German stolen in wax paper. A harmonica. A carved wooden soldier. A broken ceramic angel. A water-stained letter in French. And in the center of the case, the rusted French Adrian helmet from the hillside, with the sprig of ivy now preserved under glass placed carefully beside it. These were not the spoils of war. They were the fragments of 1,000,000 shattered Christmases, of 1,000,000,000 interrupted lives. They were the physical proof that even in the war to end all wars, in the very heart of the industrial killing machine, the human spirit with its capacity for kindness, its longing for peace, its instinct for recognizing itself in the other refused to be completely extinguished. It was a frail, flickering light, often smothered by the mud and the blood, but never completely put out. It was the Christmas that broke out in the trenches in 1914, and that, in memory, in artifact, in the shared understanding of loss, never really ended.